Great. So welcome everyone to this launch of the Open Budget Survey. It's an honor to moderate this session today. Fiscal transparency is a topic close to my heart. I was telling, when I was asked to do this, I said, oh, that was the topic of my thesis. So it's something I've focused on a lot over the years and I think is really important for delivering accountability and also stability. So welcome both to the group here in the room and also all of those joining us around the world on live streaming through YouTube. Today we're going to start with a video from the Finance Minister of Indonesia, and then have a presentation on the survey itself and the results, and some question and answers. Then we will go to the Georgian finance minister we have here. Georgia has had an impressive improvements in fiscal transparency, so we'll learn about the secrets of their success. And then have a session from the Minister of State for DFID and the FCO of Africa, Harriet Baldwin, who has some exciting new DFID policy to announce. And then we'll end up with a panel discussion. So let me start by having with the opening video statement from the Minister of Finance of Indonesia.
I am Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Minister of Finance from Indonesia. Today I welcome the launch of the survey on Open Budget 2017. The survey is a very valuable source of information for government, civil society, and many stakeholders. By assessing the transparency and accountability, it can provide a snapshot of the strength of institutions and practices that will hold government to account for how it manages and uses scarce public resources. I hosted this event in 2015 in the World Bank. At that time, I spoke about the importance of budget transparency and accountability for many countries in the world, especially developing countries, because the need for development is very high and unlimited, while the public resource is always limited. As a Finance Minister of Indonesia today, I'm also very proud to show that Indonesia is working and committed to make our budget transparent and accountable. Indonesia this year is going to have an improved score, but I think we are not going to be complacent. We need to do more because people should know how we collect money, how we use the money, and how the debt is going to be made and repaid. This is important for Indonesia people. By also having a transparency, we are going to provide all stakeholders with equal and same information. This is important for our investors as well as for rating agency. By having this kind of information, we are going to have people to participate in this public debate. We are going to create a healthy debate about a choice of the policy. And this is what we call it the ultimate value of democracy. With this year launch of the Open Budget Survey, I encourage all government, stakeholders, civil society to participate and to use the result as a lesson learned for all of us to improve our budget management. I'm proud to work together and participate with the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency as well as the International Budget Partnership. The two initiatives which is going to provide and support for all countries in the world to be able to improve transparency, to strengthen accountability, and to invite more inclusive process in their budget. I would like to congratulate the organizer and make this survey to become a milestone for all countries to improve their budget management. Thank you so much.
Well, impassioned plea there for the benefits of transparency and in particular getting civil society involved in making the decisions, contributing to the decision making in what is, after all, the general public's money which is being spent in these budgets. I now want to call on Vivek Ramkumar to come up and present the results of this year's budget survey, and then there'll be a chance for some questions and answers afterwards. Before I do that, though, just a quick note that you can follow us along on Twitter with hashtag open, let me just find it here. Apologies, Open Budget Survey. So hashtag Open Budget Survey to tweet about the events here and to follow us along. Okay, great, Vivek.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Vivek Ramkumar, and I'm Senior Director of Policy at the International Budget Partnership. I've been advocating for transparency in government for over 17 years, but the past couple of years feels different and more challenging than any of the previous years. We seem to be at a critical juncture. Around the world, there has been an increase in public mistrust in government, in part due to instances of corruption, but also because of dramatic increases in inequality. In several countries, leaders who have attempted to disguise their intolerant and reactionary agendas with populist rhetoric have been swept into power by those who have been left behind. These political shifts have driven out several government champions of transparency, especially from countries in the global south. More broadly, across countries, there has been a shrinking of civic spaces, a rollback of media freedoms, and a crackdown on those who are seeking to hold government to account, including individual activists, civil society organizations, and journalists. Because open and accountable public budgeting lies at the heart of democratic practice and equity, it is the first place we should turn to when looking for ways to expand the interaction between governments and citizens, ensuring that the public budgeting process is characterized by high levels of transparency, appropriate checks and balances, and opportunities for public participation is one essential key to stemming the decline in public confidence in government and representative democracy. In the face of the spread of such profound threats to informed and active public participation, and thus the ability of citizens to ensure that their governments will follow policies that will improve their lives, the 2017 Open Budget Survey provides critical data on the state of budget transparency and accountability around the world. More fundamentally, the survey answers two questions that are key to representative government. One are the essential conditions for representative democracy to function, that is the free flow of information and opportunities for public participation in government decision-making and oversight present in the budgeting sphere. And two are independent and empowered oversight institutions providing appropriate checks and balances and protecting the most vulnerable. The Open Budget Survey is the only independent and comparative measure of budget transparency and accountability in the world. The survey assesses whether national governments produce and disseminate to the public 8 key and basic budget documents during the course of the year in a timely, comprehensive, and accessible manner. The survey also assesses opportunities for public participation in budgeting and the strength and effectiveness of legislatures and supreme audit institutions. The transparency indicators in the survey are used to construct the Open Budget Index, which provide an overall score and rank to every country in the survey. These scores and ranks enable comparisons across countries and over time. The 2017 survey covers 115 countries, home to approximately 93% of the world's population. There are three key findings from our 2017 survey that I share with you. First, there are major gaps in the overall levels of budget information that governments are making available to citizens. The average score received by 115 countries on our 2017 Open Budget Index is only 42 out of a maximum possible score of 100. 89 countries provide insufficient levels of budget information, including 27 countries that provide scant or no information on their budgets. Overall, 40% of the budget documents assessed worldwide are not made available to citizens. These documents are either not produced for the government's internal use only, not published online, or published too late to be useful. Of particular concern are the 27 countries that do not even publish their executive's budget proposal, the foundational document giving details of a government's budget policies and priorities. Further, even when governments publish budget documents, they frequently lack sufficient information. Thus, the types of information that citizens may wish to see, such as on sector spending, budget implementation, and the goals and outcomes of spending, are missing in many government budgets. Analysis undertaken by the IBP has shown that countries with higher income, freer press, and more democratic traditions tend to have higher OBI scores and are perceived to be less corrupt, while oil-dependent autocracies tend to have lower OBI scores. Nevertheless, the performance of some countries, such as oil-dependent economies like Mexico, and relatively low-income countries like Jordan and Guatemala that provide sufficient levels of budget information, show that any government that has political will can achieve its desired levels of budget transparency. A second key and likely most troubling finding from our survey is that overall progress towards greater budget transparency has stalled for the first time since we began measuring it. The average score received by 102 countries that were assessed in our 2015 and 2017 surveys has decreased by 2 points. There has been a particularly steep reversal of previous gains achieved in sub-Saharan Africa. Of the 27 sub-Saharan African countries that were assessed in 2015 and 2017, 22 countries have seen a fall in their transparency scores, including 15 countries who've seen a significant decline in their transparency scores. There does not appear to be any overall trend explaining the regression in budget transparency. Although we have not yet undertaken an in-depth examination, a preliminary look using simple correlations around the changes in OBI scores shows that they are not strongly correlated with changes in democracy indices, income levels, oil dependency, or human development outcome measures. Our assessment indicates that the fall in budget transparency cannot be attributed to any single phenomena or to any deliberate attempt on the part of all these governments to withhold information from their citizens. There is, however, one silver lining in the otherwise discouraging news on the fall in budget transparency. Countries still provide more budget information now than they did a decade ago. The average score received by 77 countries for whom comparable data is available has increased by 6 points over the past 10 years. And some countries have achieved impressive gains in budget transparency, including Georgia, Mexico, Senegal, and Jordan. A third finding from our survey is that problems associated with lack of budget transparency are compounded by few opportunities for public participation and the existence of weak and ineffective budget oversight institutions. The 2017 survey shows that few governments offer any meaningful opportunities to their citizens to participate in the official budgeting process. The average scores received by 115 countries on indicators of public participation in our 2017 survey is only 12 out of a maximum possible score of 100. There are, however, some innovations being advanced in the field. For example, the Philippines uses budget partnership agreements to provide formal authority to civil society organizations to attend meetings in which the budgets of individual agencies are formulated. In some instances, these budget partnership agreements have strengthened the ability of individual agencies to negotiate their budgets with the Central Budget Ministry. South Korea operates a waste reporting center that enables its public to submit complaints on mismanagement of public funds. Over the past 16 years, the center has saved the government an average of more than $1 billion a year. And the Canadian legislature claims to have registered more than 1 million interactions with their citizens using various platforms during last year's pre-budget consultations. While civil society budget monitoring work is important, it cannot and should not replace the role played by formal government institutions in providing comprehensive oversight. Yet over 40% of the legislatures assessed worldwide did not make a single amendment to the budgets presented to them by their executives. And more than a third of the legislatures did not assess any audit report on the budget issued by their nation's supreme audit institutions. The 2017 survey finds that legislatures tend to exercise greater oversight during the initial phase of the budget cycle than during budget implementation. As a result, executives tend to exercise greater restraint when the budget is being approved by legislature, only to make changes to it subsequently when there is more limited legislative review. This can often lead to spending that is not in line with the priorities of the approved budget and generally opens the door for executive mismanagement of public funds. While the majority of Supreme Audit institutions have adequate levels of operational and legal independence, what is noteworthy is that countries that are less transparent on their budgets, such as the 38 countries that do not publish their audit reports, have audit institutions that are less empowered than their counterparts in other countries. The design of the Open Budget Survey is based on the premise that efficient, effective, and accountable budgets rest on 3 pillars of budget transparency, public participation, and strong oversight provided by formal government institutions. The absence of any of these 3 components can weaken the entire system. Yet the survey finds that no country is solid across all 3 pillars, while 22 countries fail to meet the survey's standard of adequacy on any of these 3 measures. The right package of budget transparency reforms depend on the specific deficiencies in a country's budgeting system. Accordingly, the IBP publishes individual country summaries with tailored recommendations. But the survey findings also lend themselves to general recommendations for governments, civil society organizations, and donors. The IBP urges national governments to institute mechanisms for public participation in budgeting and to complement these measures by achieving a threshold score of above 60 on the Open Budget Index, which will make the participation mechanisms more meaningful. A first step for all governments to take is to publish budget documents that they already produce. The 2017 survey found that more than 20% of the budget documents assessed across the 115 countries are currently produced by governments for their internal use only or are published too late to be useful, and could easily be published on existing government websites in a timely fashion at minimal cost to government. Further, governments should ensure that they publish budget documents consistently from one budget cycle to another. Finally, governments should prioritize transparency reforms based on the specific needs that citizens have on budget information, such as information on sector spending, budget implementation, and the goals and outcomes of spending. Civil society organizations should continue to advocate for greater budget transparency while simultaneously emphasizing the importance of having vulnerable voices heard in budget debates. They should make maximum use of available budget information and participate in budget debates to the maximum extent possible. Finally, civil society organizations should seek to broaden the constituencies demanding transparency reforms to include social movements, government champions, and private sector actors. Donors should reconsider their strategies so that they are using and leveraging their foreign assistance in ways that enhance transparency and accountability. This can be achieved by improving donor coordination with domestic actors, like civil society organizations and government oversight institutions. By focusing not just on transparency reforms, but the sustainability of these reforms, and by supporting measures that enhance public participation in budgeting. Excuse me. In conclusion, let me emphasize that the 2017 Open Budget Survey makes clear that governments are providing less budget information now than they did 2 years ago, and are failing to create spaces for citizens to have a voice in budget decision making. If these trends continue, governments will inevitably become less accountable to citizens. This should be of concern to everyone who is interested in reinvigorating democratic practice, re-engaging the disaffected, and reinstating public trust in government institutions. As such, the challenge before us is clear. It is now up to us to work together and use the tools at our disposal to reverse these trends. Thank you.
So we're going to have, we have a few minutes for questions to Vivek. I don't know whether you're going to stay up here or come over here, but
I can just stand here.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Hi. Thanks very much. I'm very impressed. It's great to see this. One question, though, is, or two questions, actually.
Maybe you could introduce yourself and say.
Something done that democracy matters. And the question is that there is a real danger that by making lots of information available, you do the job of commercial lobbyists and professional campaigners so that they get lots of information much more easily than previously and widen the gap with the general public. Unless there is real commitment to education and making the information accessible to a way that ordinary citizens go. And I wondered whether you looked at that. And the second question, very briefly, is are there any plans to look at the transparency of the European Union?
Sorry. You want to take a few in a row? Yeah. One at the back. And maybe we should wait for microphones so that the people on.
Thanks, Vivek. Duncan Green from Oxfam and LSE. I may have missed it, but you seem to have lots of things which are not the reason for the sharp fall in sub-Saharan Africa. But I didn't hear you speculate, and I'm sure you speculated loads around the water cooler. So even if you don't have hard evidence, why do you think there's been this sharp about turn in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yep, over here. In the front.
Thank you. My name is Julius Mukunda from the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group in Uganda. I have one particular question which I would like to have an answer, is that the capacity of CSOs, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, to comprehend with the current available budget information. Did you happen to come across any of the solutions? Thank you.
Do you want to take those?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for those questions. I'll take them in the order they were given. So about the use or misuse of information, or probably the benefits of greater transparency going to commercial interests. That very well might be the case that initially the people who use budget information are the ones who are better organized to use information. We are interested not just in governments publishing information on their budgets, but in publishing them in formats that are accessible to citizens. That's why one of the budget documents that we've called for governments to publish is something called a citizen's budget, which is a simplified presentation of technical budget documents. And we've seen that now more than half the governments around the world have begun publishing these documents. But much more efforts need to be paid in making budget information truly accessible to citizens. So it's definitely not an area that we would be satisfied with just governments publishing the raw data without creating mechanisms for citizens to be able to understand that information and also, more importantly, participate in the budgeting process. We don't assess the EU's budget as yet. We've got 115 countries that we've assessed in our survey, and we do intend to add a few more countries each round of the survey. There are European groups, though, who are in touch with us, who are interested in assessing the transparency of the EU's budget, and so we'd support their efforts to undertake that initiative. On Duncan's question on why sub-Saharan Africa has fallen, we frankly don't know. So we would like to understand that issue better, and there is a panel discussion later this morning that is also going to look into that issue. We are very concerned about the fall in budget transparency in Africa because the regression has been most marked in that continent. And the reason we are really worried about it is that that's the region of the world where we saw some of the best improvements in the last two rounds of our survey. But even with those improvements, it was not that countries in the continent had achieved sufficient levels of budget transparency. And so for the first time to see that the trend from one of accelerated transparency is reduced quite sharply in some cases is worrying to us. We'd like to understand whether it is something that fits in with the closing civic spaces that is characterized in several countries, democratic deficits that are growing around the world. One would wonder whether the involvement of other models of governance that have now come into Africa, especially with increased Chinese investments, is playing a role in that. But at this stage, all we can say is that it's speculation. My colleague Jason Lakin had done some correlations between the OBI scores and some other measures. And one of the interesting things that he found is that countries that had recently issued bonds in the international markets were more transparent than those that had not. So maybe even there is a driver of transparency that comes in when governments have to deal with international financial markets. On civil society groups using budget information, that is something that is essential. So although the Open Budget Survey does not look into how civil society groups use budget information, we've undertaken separate studies to understand this issue of how much demand is there for budget information, who's using it, and how useful do they find information to be. And we found that, especially in African civil society organizations, there is a demand for more information to be put out there than is currently available. And one of the reasons why there is not as much analytical work that is happening in the continent is because the types of budget information that governments are making available are not necessarily in line with what citizens are looking for. And that's why a key recommendation that we have in this year's report is for governments not just to become more transparent, but to become more transparent in a sustainable way so that there is predictable budget data that is put out from one budget cycle to another, and that governments focus on transparency measures that are truly meeting the needs that citizens have around budget information.
Do we have time for two more, maybe? Okay. Looking for any women? No? Okay.
My name is Adriano Vunga from Mozambique. This is really a small footnote in addition to what Vivek has said in relation to the declining trends of transparency in Africa and for Mozambique. what I've seen in my country is the gains that we had in budget transparency had to do with the dependence on aid, which moved from projects to direct budget support. And that came with conditionalities, not only in making information available, but the substance in that, in those documents. With the shift from aid towards extractive industries, where donors have less possibilities of influencing them, what we see is that not only the incentives to produce documents have reduced, but also, and most importantly here, is the quality of the information produced. It has declined. And so information is still there, but the quality of that information tends to reduce, and therefore this declining trend in the case of Mozambique. Thank you.
Last one.
I'm John Burton from KPMG. You mentioned there was an overall correlation, broadly speaking, between level of development and performance on the index, but there are presumably quite interesting case studies then of countries which aren't that rich that perform very well, like South Africa and Georgia, for example, and countries which are fairly rich but perform very badly, like perhaps China. I just wondered whether you focus in on those particular countries and see what lessons can be learned from that. And I also just wanted to ask a question about the grey countries which are not included. Can you say a bit more about, Ethiopia, for example, seems an important emission in your index.
Did you say Egypt?
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia.
But why are some countries not included, like Ethiopia? Thank you.
Great. Yeah, should we take one more of the question? There was no question from Mozambique.
Okay, well, maybe I'll jump in and ask a question, which is you didn't talk about the role of the media, which is potentially a way to summarize, and certainly some of the research has suggested that it's a combination of transparency and local media that picks it up, which is important for providing, improving outcomes.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So what our survey has generally shown when we ran the correlations is that countries that are higher income do tend to have higher OBI scores, but as you identify, there are countries that are not as rich that do relatively well on budget transparency. It's the oil-dependent autocracies, very wealthy countries, Equatorial Guinea, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, that perform really dismally on budget transparency. Our key takeaway from this issue is one that any government that has political will can achieve its desired levels of budget transparency. So this is not necessarily a problem of poor countries not being transparent because they don't have money to become transparent. What we found is that a lot of development efforts especially around public financial management reforms, where lots of technical assistance and resources are invested, are being spent on building up infrastructure in governments to be able to manage their public finances. And oftentimes, governments that we speak to will tell us that transparency will follow after we get the PFM reforms in place. And we find that is very often than not the case. That the sequencing that is proposed by governments, that first let's build up our systems and then we'll think about transparency, does not work. And there is an important need to emphasize that transparency should accompany the efforts of governments even as they are building up their public financial management systems. And an important reason for that is that governments, even when they have faulty data, because they have weak PFM capacity, are relying on that very same data to make very important decisions on our behalf. So we as citizens have a right to know what is it that they are relying on, what's that underlying data that they are using to make decisions, so that we are all taking these risks in as informed a manner as is possible for us. The second thing that we found is that a lot of low-income countries that perform poorly on budget transparency already have budget documents that they've produced only for their internal use. And they could very easily make available on their existing government websites at almost no cost to them and achieve that overnight. So almost 20% of the budget transparency that we have identified, at least using one metric, could be solved in the next 5 minutes if we can magically persuade all governments around the world that, press the button and load that document up on your websites. They have it with them. When it comes to the other part of your question was around the exclusion of some countries. We would like to have more countries in our survey. Right now, we've sort of built up the number of countries in each successive rounds from 60 countries in the first round to 115 countries. As we are able to obtain more resources, we keep adding countries. So the hope is that especially a country like Ethiopia, it's an important omission, and we'd like to include it in hopefully the next round of our survey. But there are other countries like Iran also that we think interesting things are happening right now on budget transparency that should be included in the survey. So we would like to add additional countries. So there's no deliberate reason why we have excluded some countries. It's we want a geographical representation of countries from all parts of the world, and some have got excluded. On the role of the media, we do think that the media plays a critical role in both demanding greater budget transparency from government and also in being an intermediary, in being able to translate the information that governments produce into formats that are more accessible to citizens and to foster public discussion and debates on budgets. Unfortunately, media in many countries are not focused on budgets, and especially not focused on budgets throughout the budget cycle. More often than not, when the finance minister or the head of state tables the budget before parliament, that's the point of time where there is some coverage in the media in most countries. But following the day or the week after the tabling of the executive's budget proposal, there's very little proper comprehensive media coverage on this issue. And so it's a gap because there's so many problems that happen during budget implementation that do need to get picked up. And it's not just the allocation side that deserve attention, but also the execution of budgets. And so we have not made as much efforts as I think we could in fostering and cultivating a relationship with governments, because our focus is on civil society organizations, but we are very mindful of the fact that there is an important role that media can play in supporting the expansion of budget transparency and, more importantly, accountability around government budgets.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I'd now like to call up Minister Mahmoud Bakhtadze, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name. The Minister of Finance for Georgia, as I said before, a country that has made impressive improvements in increasing transparency in your budget. So maybe, Minister, I could start by asking what was the impetus to make some of those reforms and make your budget more open and transparent and the process more participatory? And, what were some of the changes that you introduced?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a big pleasure for me to have a chance to speak with the audience. So it's a second event for us, and really it's a big achievement for our country. Georgia is a relatively small economy in a very vibrant region. And around 10 years ago, we were in the list of countries with the very low level of transparency. And of course, when we look back to the path that we have gone through, of course, it's make us really very proud. Georgia is regarded as an outlier in the region. We are in the top list of all major international rankings. And for a very simple reason. Government of Georgia has a strategy to make Georgia a regional hub. We are a country that does not have mineral resources, and we have at the same time the aspiration to become a member of European Union, because culturally, historically, Georgia has always been the part of European family. And there is a big gap between our aspirations and the economic situations that we had in our country. And of course, making governance more efficient, more open, creating a friendly business environment in our country is an only solution to reach this goal. And of course, if you ask me what is the best formula to do that, it's not easy to provide such a simple formula, but of course I have to agree with Vivek. Everything starts from the political will. And this is my personal opinion that if there is a will, if there is will, there will be a result as well. And of course, the coordination between the decision makers within a government is also a very important precondition to be successful. And of course, sustainability, because making reforms, reaching some result is sometimes much easier than maintaining the bar on a very high level. Therefore, sustainability for us is a key priority. Of course, open budget index is also a very important milestone for us in our economic policy, because to be in the top 5 means that we have to address now the weaknesses which we still have, but of course we will need more complex approaches to overcome these disadvantages. Because 5-6 years ago, when we step by step improved our position in the index, we had to implement relatively easy reforms. Now, and when you are pushing bar above, of course, you have to implement more complex reforms. And I also would like to emphasize very important fact from government and from managerial perspective, because when you implement the reforms with a high level of sensitivity, in our opinion, participation of civil society actually helps you a lot. Yes, and this is also one of the main reasons why I do believe that for governments, it's really, for emerging markets especially, it's a very good chance to incorporate into this decision-making process the civil society. And this will make the implementation process afterwards much easier. This is the experience of Georgia and the case about Georgia.
Great. I wondered if you could just elaborate a bit on how you introduce and incorporate civil society into some of the decision-making. Are there processes that you have found particularly helpful that other people could learn from, or things that you want to do more of?
Not some, actually. I mean, we are trying to incorporate civil society in a majority of the decision-making process. And of course, the uniqueness of Open Budget Index is that it is evaluated by non-government sectors and government agencies are not participating in it. As I have mentioned, OBI index for us, is one of the most important rankings, but we are doing good in other international rankings as well. And we have this strategy to make Georgia a regional hub for finance, trade, logistics, and tourism. And in order to achieve this goal, we have to implement very sensitive reforms. So when we are crafting an action plan to address these priorities, we are trying to incorporate civil society, non-government organizations. How we are doing that? We have the online platforms, and via these online platforms, everybody has a possibility to tell us their recommendation or to oppose to some of the steps that government tends to make. Usually we spend more time in crafting the action plan because it saves more time for the government during the implementation process because everybody is on the same page afterwards, yes, when you are discussing the issues in advance. So, I mean, my point is that from a managerial perspective, it's really a very good opportunity for the government to make the decision-making process more transparent on the one hand, and on the other, to reach a result in a shorter period of time. So it's not the process-oriented goal. It's actually a result-oriented goal.
I wonder if there are any times where you felt pressure from your colleagues to not be transparent, and how you've persuaded them, within government that this is the right way to go. Talk to us about some of the things that have been challenging in this process.
Of course, as one of the preconditions to be successful, my point was that the coordination between the decision makers inside government is very important. And everything starts from the political will. And therefore, we did not have any huge issues about it because that's an ultimate goal for the government, and everybody works to achieve this goal. And there is a coordination among stakeholders. There is a coordination among the working groups. Okay, once the political will is on the table, everything becomes much easier.
Great. And I wonder what you've talked about the citizen engagement and participation, and some of the online platforms that you've used. Do you feel like this is more than, you've talked a bit about how people have, you see this as important, becoming a regional hub. How do you think of it when you talk to, say, investors? Is this something that comes up, that your level of openness is important to them? And, in what ways do you think it is? So, it could have these long-run potential benefits.
Absolutely, because as I have mentioned, for government of Georgia, attracting FDI in our economy is one of the biggest priorities, and in 2017 the amount of FDI in our economy was all-time high. And of course, being in a top list of these major international rankings help us a lot during the negotiations with the investors. And of course, at the end of the day, investors are looking to invest in the countries which has good economic perspective, that has very transparent rules of game, in which the safety is on a very high level, etc. So, of course, this argument helps us a lot during the conversations with the international investors. And also on the civil society engagement side, we scored 22 in BI, in that component, which of course is not the highest figure possible. However, if you look at the average is about 12. So we are not doing so bad in that component as well. But of course, we plan to address this topic, and we do hope that during coming years we will be able to significantly improve our position in that component as well. We are now studying the experience of South Korea. We think that that may be a good case for Georgia, because of course government also try to provide the information to society in the most user-friendly way possible, because generally public is interested in mostly in practical aspects of the budget and are less interested about complicated macroeconomic figures. So to have the information which is as user-friendly as possible, in my opinion, is also very important precondition to engage civil society even more.
Okay, I think we're about on time. So unless you have any last words of wisdom for your fellow ministers of finance, I'd like to thank you and wish you good luck for improving your scores even further in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, it's now my pleasure to welcome the Minister of State for Africa, for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and also a Minister of State within DFID, my own department, to come and talk about the open budget survey and also the new transparency policy in the UK. Welcome.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to Westminster this morning. Obviously, a location that we're very proud of as the heart of our democracy. In fact, where you are today is on a location known as Broad Sanctuary, which historically meant that because we were near Westminster Abbey, you could flee from the civil authorities and take refuge in this location. That has been abolished, I just want to warn you. But I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about transparency, because it is the principle which underlines the Open Budget Survey. And of course, transparency truly does have a human face. Whether it's the 12-year-old girl who can get an education because her parents' taxes are properly invested in her local school, or whether it's the mother who can get access to justice when she needs it because corruption has been rooted out of her legal system, or whether it's the face of the local entrepreneur who can provide for her family because she can set up a business quickly and easily. We know that transparency is at the heart of all human development. It's very much the springboard that enables countries to collect taxes fairly, to improve their public services, and to build open and accountable systems and institutions so that they can transform their citizens' lives for the better, and so that they don't have to rely on aid. And that is why the UK has been transparency's strongest advocate. We've led the way in making our government as transparent as possible and being transparent in how we provide aid. And now we want to see a global transparency revolution. And that's why I'm launching today our new agenda called Open Aid, Open Societies. This agenda is about encouraging developing countries to open up their governments to scrutiny by their own citizens. It's about driving transparency standards across the world. And it's about making sure that UK taxpayers know where their aid is spent. Promoting transparency is about a fairer world. We know that open societies are more likely to achieve sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Growth that is essential if countries are to pull themselves out of poverty and stand on their own 2 feet, no longer reliant on aid. In order to achieve this, countries need effective taxation and public finance systems. And that's why we're setting up a new taxation and public finance unit within the Department for International Development, and why we are sharpening the focus on transparent and effective public expenditure. We know that people are more willing to pay their taxes if they think the system is fair, and if they can see what government is doing with their money. A great example is in the South Kivu province in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where tax collection jumped 16-fold when citizens saw the local government was responding to their requests for repairs to roads and to schools. Our new agenda will involve more work with governments in developing countries to open up budgets, strengthening the parliamentary oversight, building the supreme audit institutions, and helping citizens and a free media to scrutinise how public money and aid is spent. The International Budget Partnership plays a vital role in monitoring and encouraging progress. The Department for International Development has been promoting budget transparency and accountability in our partner countries for many years. And one of the most valuable programmes we've supported since 2009 is the International Budget Partnership and its work on the Open Budget Survey. When we partner with a government, we want to know how open they are with their citizens. We want to know if there are strong oversight institutions, such as Parliament and a supreme audit institution like our own National Audit Office, scrutinising public spending. One of the main places the Department for International Development country offices will look to for their source of information on these issues is indeed the Open Budget Survey. The survey has played an invaluable role in monitoring and incentivising progress in government budget transparency since it was first conducted in 2006. And successive surveys documented a steady improvement in performance over the decade to 2015. So it's of concern that the Open Budget Survey 2017 finds progress has stalled. And in some cases, it's regressed. 22 of 27 sub-Saharan African countries, for example, saw their transparency scores fall. And it's vital that we establish what's behind these latest findings. Personally, I will make sure that we continue to work with governments to encourage more sharing and debate of budget information with parliaments and with the public. The 2017 Open Budget Survey demonstrates that there is more work to be done. We now need to focus on improving results. Access to this kind of information is a right that all governments should extend to their citizens so that they know how their taxes are spent and how their country is run. And journalists and civil society organisations are critical in interpreting and translating budget data, sharing it with citizens and parliaments in ways that are meaningful. This scrutiny can galvanise those with decision-making power to act and reduce malpractice. And it's very sad to see that in many countries today, the rights to information and expression are under threat. Global press freedom declined to its lowest point in 13 years in 2016, amid unparalleled threats to journalists and media outlets. Over the past 11 years, more than 900 journalists globally have been killed simply for doing their jobs, and 90% of crimes committed against journalists remain unprosecuted. When it comes to attempts to curtail freedom of speech, our message is simple. We will always listen. We will stand alongside civil society. And we will put citizens at the heart of our transparency efforts. And as one of its founding members, the UK will partner with the Open Government Partnership, which is promoting transparency action plans in 75 member countries around the world. But clearly, transparency doesn't stop at international borders. The new UK anti-corruption strategy, published last December, sets out an ambitious framework for fighting corruption here at home as well as overseas. And transparency sits at the heart of it. We will help countries to implement global tax transparency standards, to support them in clamping down on offshore tax evasion. We will strengthen international standards on transparency too, in the extractive industry sector, in the construction sector, and beyond. We will reduce the risk of corruption by encouraging transparent and responsible commodity trading practices. For example, when Ghana joined the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative in 2007, its early reports revealed very low levels of government revenues from the gold mining sector. Consequently, Ghanaian civil society began advocating for change. This led to revisions in Ghana's mining tax law, with revenues from mining more than doubling between 2010 and 2011, going from $210 million to $500 million. And a new act was passed which allows the government to invest between 50 and 75% of oil revenues in social and infrastructure programs. The Criminal Finances Act that we passed in April last year significantly improves the UK's ability to tackle international money laundering, corruption, tax evasion, and terrorist financing. And last year, we became the first G20 country to launch a public company beneficial ownership register, so we can see who owns UK companies. We will work with other countries to encourage them to do the same and improve international sharing of information on company ownership. Being transparent about how we spend our own aid is also vital. Some people will always be critical of aid, but we cannot build confidence with UK taxpayers if we are not open about what we're doing. The UK has a great tradition of leadership in aid transparency. Our development tracker was the first of its kind and has been widely replicated by aid agencies around the world. We were one of the first agencies to publish our data to the International Aid Transparency Initiative data standard. But there's always more to do. In this new agenda, the UK will ensure that we continue to strengthen the transparency of all UK aid. And we will encourage our development partners to meet ever higher standards in how they publish their data. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe aid spending has immense power to end disease, hunger, and extreme poverty. It can build strong economies, it can sustain inclusive growth, and it can help the world's most vulnerable people to live lives of dignity. But for this to succeed in the long term, we must set ever higher global standards on open government. With our new Open Aid, Open Societies agenda, we're committed to building on our UK leadership and going further. But we cannot lead this agenda alone. A transparency revolution on this scale requires a truly global effort. And I'm calling on all of you, our partners around the world, in the private sector, in the public sector, in civil society, and in international organisations to share our vision. We must empower people to access the information they're entitled to see and to speak out freely without fear of intimidation. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it's only by doing this that we can sustain the way aid works to make our world a better place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And for all of those who are interested to find details of the new transparency agenda, it's available at gov.uk. Open Aid, Open Societies. So thank you very much, Minister. So I would like now to invite up our next panel, which is consists of Danny, and again, apologies for pronunciation, Danny Srikandaraja is the Secretary General of Civicus, Carolina Renteria, who is Division Chief of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF, and Julia Pellegrini, Portfolio Manager at BlackRock, and Alta Fulcher, public finance expert with Mokoro in South Africa. So if you could all come up, that would be great. Sorry. So Danny, maybe I can start with you as the only man on the panel. So we heard from Vivek at the beginning about, potentially whether there was some relationship between the failure to improve on transparency across the countries in the survey this time and potential, closing of civic spaces. I wondered if you could just, comment on that and whether you think whether these two things are related or.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I did make I like many men, have signed the pledge to boycott or girlcott all male panels, and I'm feeling a bit conflicted about being the only man on an all-female panel. Should I boycott it or not? No,
you have to show up.
I have to show up.
Provide balance.
So I think, look, it's too early. We've not done the numbers as such, but we have a research tool called the Civicus Monitor, which looks at civic freedoms, the freedom of expression, assembly and association in 195 countries, and does a similar exercise where we classify each country on a 5-point scale. And we haven't run any sort of analysis of whether there is a correlation or some sort of link of what's going on. It's too early. But my intuition is, yes, there's, what we have been seeing in our own research is there a steady decline in the conditions for civil society, the sort of enabling environment for citizens to organize, to take action, to speak out, for NGOs or civil society organizations to just exist. I mean, the sorts of regulatory interference that we're seeing with across the world, including in mature democracies, particularly aimed at organizations that are there buttressing civic freedoms, civil rights, democracy, human rights, speaking up for marginalized voices, and of course, holding power to account. So I think there is a deeply worrying trend about closing civic space, and why that's so important, I think we've heard in many different versions already this morning, because doing openness and producing a whole range of data is a good start, but it's nowhere near sufficient to complete the sort of accountability loop unless you have a strong, independent, and capable civil society that can then use that data, that information, to drive accountability. And our worry is, despite all of the wonderful innovations we've had in openness across a range of arenas, we've still got a weak, and in some cases weakening, demand side, which we need to address urgently, and which governments have a responsibility to uphold. And I was really enthused to hear the Georgian minister talk about how useful it can be to have civil society involved in that process, or indeed citizens involved in that process.
Right. Carolina, we heard from the commentator from Mozambique the role of donors to, encourage, push, cajole countries into greater openness. Maybe you could talk about, what the IMF's response needs to be to, these potentially concerning trends.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. So first of all, I think part of what has been discussed thus far is this is an effort of many, and I think in this room we are all advocates of fiscal transparency and the importance to work with governments. And I was really pleased also to hear the Minister of Georgia, which he very clearly said, you need leadership at the top. He said it more than once, and I think that is very, very important. And our role, one very important role we have is to support those leaders. So whenever we see governments that are reform-oriented, we really need to work with them. Georgia, again, is a very good example. We recently, in 2016, did the fiscal transparency evaluation for Georgia. That, I would say, is the instrument that right now correlates better with the topic we are dealing with. We improved our fiscal transparency code back in 2015, and thus far we have done 22 fiscal transparency evaluations in which we look at many areas. It's divided in 3 pillars, and there's a 4th pillar coming. The first pillar has to deal with all the reporting of fiscal data, which is important because you not only need information, you need good quality information, and that's where we have a role to play in terms of looking at standards and producing good information. The second pillar is about budgeting, the process, which is very important. And in that pillar, for example, and I will talk later about it, we are measuring public participation. So our tools, even being the IMF, are looking at issues that deal directly with civil society and governments, how they interact around the budget. The third pillar is something that has not been mentioned a lot today, which is fiscal risks and continuing liabilities. It is very important because you not only need to know what it's on the surface, you need to know what it's below. Because at the end, part of why we are struggling is because the information, even to governments, sometimes is not evident and therefore needs to be used. And the 4th pillar that it's coming, and that has been mentioned very much today, it's with natural resource-oriented countries. Those that have a lot of natural resources that, let's say, have been blessed, how to make it a blessing and not a curse, as it has been in many cases. So there's this new pillar that is coming in which we are going to address very clearly the topic of natural resources. Our role is to continue promoting the importance of fiscal transparency and budget transparency, support reform-oriented countries. I think that is where we have identified them and then go along with them. With Georgia, after the fiscal transparency evaluation, there's a reform plan. So there was recognition of the improvements, and I think our role is also to recognize. It's difficult to reform. Governments have many things to do at the same time, and us as institutions that support these efforts, it's good once in a while to recognize the improvements that have been made and be on the side in the implementation of reforms. As the minister said, the new wave of reforms are going to be much harder, more difficult technically, more difficult to sell, let's say, to different stakeholders. So this is a process that takes a lot of time and effort. We are very involved in many of the African countries that were, that I see that there was a going backwards. I think we have to take a closer look at that and understand better how we can support those governments. The trend continues to be positive in a long-term period. Some issues might have happened in these last 2 years, so I think we need to really drill down and understand better also, because the point is find the problem to bring a solution, not just keep saying there has been a going backwards. I think we need to be looking forward and identify very clearly what happened, and from our role in the IMF support that effort.
Thanks. You mentioned the role of investors, and also that investors care particularly about these transparency on the off-balance sheet liabilities, which many countries have, and investors get very nervous about not knowing how much debt a country actually has, and indeed, there's some work showing that when the IMF produced these fiscal evaluations and people signed up to be evaluated, then you actually saw improvements in the bond markets. Investors were willing to charge less to countries that were more open about this. But do you think investors care about some of these other aspects of transparency as well, of civic participation, or are they mainly worried about the transparency, as I say, of things like off-balance sheet liabilities?
I think they care about both issues. I mean, if they don't, they really should. It really does help us do a better job and deliver better value for our clients. We are increasingly encouraged, at least I work for BlackRock, and we are increasingly encouraged to take a very active role in assessing the entities we invest in and ask tougher questions. Our CEO has been particularly vocal about this even in recent weeks. We tend to do this routinely when we engage with countries in, for example, roadshows, when they come and issue Eurobonds. We have the chance to engage with them, go through their financial statements, ask about issues such as contingent liabilities. This is something we look at very closely, because unfortunately there have been cases in the not so distant past where even in countries where the IMF has an active engagement, there have been instances where unfortunately there have been some debt sort of hidden away from not just investors, but again, their own citizens. I flew in this morning, so I apologize for being particularly slow after a sleepless night, but I was on a trip to a couple of African countries over the past 10 days, and it was particularly interesting because in one of them, we had a discussion with a couple of civil society organizations, and there was also a famous journalist of a local paper. And they were asking an official from the Ministry of Finance why he had stood up saying that, for example, agriculture was a key priority sector for his government, when in fact his own budget was showing that 0.4% of total spending was going to agriculture. So there are these signs of engagement at the local level, and that's extremely positive because, as I said, it really does help us as well. Being able to go back to our clients that are also asking increasingly tough questions to us on how we invest their money and how we intend to produce long-term value for them.
Great. So you mentioned talking to investors across Africa. Maybe I can turn to you, Alta, now and ask you why you think we're seeing this less than positive trend across Africa in openness, and are you surprised about it? What do you think might be driving it?
I think in some aspects it isn't particularly surprising, but connected to other things it is. Just to look briefly at why it may not be surprising. A first factor that we have to take notice of is that the methodology for the survey or for the Open Budget Index and the survey and the scoring has changed between 2015 and 2017 It now requires countries to make key documents available online on time, which is a very positive change. It makes it available more broadly, not only for the organizations that can afford to purchase the documents from the Ministry of Finance. It makes it available for citizens. It makes it available across the country. So it's a positive change. But I think we could have expected a reset of the level of transparency in Africa linked to this change. I mean, any one of us who have visited websites of ministries of finance in Africa to extract budget data for studies would know they often shadow. They only have information on how the ministry is structured. They often don't function particularly well. The links don't work. And even when there is budget information purportedly online, it is often very much out of date. You can see the website was set up a few years ago. Information was published for a couple of years and then it stopped. So the change in the methodology requires ministries of finance to step up in Africa and now actually start working on making the documents available online and on time. And I think in the report itself, it shows there's a discussion that the 11 points on average decline in Africa would have been 3 to 6 if it weren't for this methodology change. So it explains partly. The other reason why I think we shouldn't be too surprised is that volatility is common. You often, if a country publishes once or twice, it is not a guarantee that it will continue to publish. The two countries in Africa that do quite well, South Africa and Uganda, has got a long-term practice of just automatically assuming within the Ministry of Finance that publishing at the end of a budget process or during the budget cycle, budget implementation cycle, that's very much part of what they do. There's a whole system set up to do that. If that system isn't in place, if that capacity isn't there, then you can expect volatility. And over time, and I've participated in some studies of the IBP to look at why does that volatility happen, and that's one of the driving factors is the systematic capacity in the systems to publish during a budget process isn't necessarily there. But that's not the only thing. I think we've heard this morning other factors that explain this volatility. The incentives have been mentioned, markets have been mentioned, access to different kinds of lenders and different sources of finance have changed incentives for ministries of finance. But I think there's another factor that I haven't heard as yet this morning, and that's around low tax bases in many African countries. So it's not only that citizens don't have that extra incentive to be interested in how money is being raised and used by their governments. It is also that they don't have the incentive to raise a red flag when they notice that a document is suddenly no longer published. If the Auditor General's report is suddenly not on time anymore, like I saw it is now in Namibia, there isn't a sort of a broad outcry from citizens to say, hang on, what's going on here? You do have organizations in many of these countries who will notice, will put a press release out, etc. But then you mentioned the media earlier. You don't have the media capacity to amplify that issue so that it becomes an issue for the government. So incentives to keep on publishing is an issue. There are also, I mentioned systems, but there's also institutional changes that occur in government. So a unit or a champion of transparency that made it possible for a government to publish information for a period of time suddenly is reorganized, ministries split and join, and so that capacity and leadership that we've also heard about is no longer there to make sure that the publication keeps on happening. And of course, just capacity. PFM reform priorities change over time. Ministries of finance in Africa have very thin technical capacity quite often. So people who were involved in making sure that information gets out into the public domain on time are suddenly occupied with a different set of priorities because the PFM reform priorities have shifted. So I think it would be good to see what has been the role of PFM reform strategies and donor support for these strategies over time. So those are the reasons why one shouldn't be too surprised. But just to say there is a very big reason why we should be surprised, and this is, so the volatility means that those who increased a lot are also those who seem to have declined quite a bit in Africa, the ones in 2015 and then in 2017. But why aren't there other ones who have now suddenly increased? Why haven't information improved in documents? And I think that is when we have to go back to the incentives and look and see on a country-by-country basis and try to understand why haven't we seen an improvement to offset the decline in just the normal patterns of volatility that happen.
We've been talking about some of the positive incentives here. I want to come back, Danny, to you and ask you a question about the incentives on politicians. I mean, we're talking about transparency, increasing accountability, and obviously, you know, we can point to the positives in terms of investors like this, your citizens like it, but it also puts constraints on politicians potentially. So how do you think, how do you think this transparency is working in terms of, can it strengthen democracy, but then can you also see some pushback, and have you seen pushback from politicians, saying, I don't want to be constrained in this way? Are there examples of that? So of sort of positive, but also recognizing that that positive comes with a negative for some actors in this space?
Well, I'm not sure. I haven't come across too many examples where sort of senior leaders anywhere in the world have really, that I felt have been motivated by the ultimate incentive here, which surely should be that investing in transparency leads to greater sort of participatory democracy, citizen engagement, and therefore strengthens democracy and every sort of all political institutions. That seems rarely, if ever, to appear on a sort of politician's strategy. Of course, in some cases, as we've heard, donor pressure matters, perhaps investor pressure matters, perhaps media pressure matters. Perhaps there's a bit of a race to the top, and initiatives like the Open Budget Survey help to do that. But to me, if this is to be about strengthening democracy, which I think it should be, then we need to put that particular incentive back into sort of the political mind.
So how do we do that?
Well, I think first of all we have to address, I was going to follow up on Alta's point, that I think again in an ideal world you'd have lots and lots of citizens, and this is to Titus's question earlier, lots of citizens engaged in this information, playing around with the data, seeing what works, what doesn't. But in the current world that we have, the institutions that seem to matter most are those independent, organized bits of civil society whose job it is to look through that data, to see where there are shortfall, where there are problems, where things could be done better. And our worry is, if you take several African countries this year, those institutions are being systematically undermined. Not necessarily because of issues around fiscal transparency, but for a range of other issues. If you have, as you've had in Kenya, large bits of the media shut down in recent weeks, if you have, as you've had in Uganda, several key organizations that have worked on accountability have their offices raided and their bank accounts frozen, as has happened, if you have had in South Africa, for example, despite all of this good work, where the withdrawal of donors, leaving some of the most important accountability organizations in South Africa, the Treatment Action Campaign, Section 27, Equal Education, struggling for resources to even exist, the enabling environment for that sort of mutuality to happen, or even that pressure to build on politicians for them to figure this as an incentive, is being undermined. And so, this evidence, with the caveats that Alta's made, goes into what is a potentially very toxic storm when it comes to the sort of diminishing environment for accountability. And that's what I'm worried. And then the sort of the attack on civil society is part of that problem.
And solutions?
Solutions, I think, have to be about, I mean, I would argue, and I work for a civil society alliance, have to include building the demand side capacity. So working with those institutions close to the ground who are legitimate actors in their own societies to be able to use, curate, generate data that relates to public accountability. We haven't had enough of that. I mean, I'm curious to see with this new announcement from DFID how much of that resource will end up close to the ground, supporting those institutions that I've just mentioned. Because the record has it that only 1% of all ODA goes directly to Southern NGOs. 1% of all of the $165 billion actually goes directly to Southern institutions, civil society institutions. So that would be a good place to start.
And Carolina, what is the IMF doing to support the, are you with your mandate able to support civil society organizations or support their involvement in the budget process? I guess you'd have to work through the government given your mandate. But
yes, because our member countries are our focus of intervention, let's put it that way. But I do think, information here is key. Good information, timely information, open information, and information that tells a story. That really, because budget numbers could be pages and pages and pages of numbers, and you need to understand what is behind. In that sense, we are really pushing governments to make the information more accurate and more transparent. We, for example, in the fiscal transparency evaluation in a couple of countries that we have done, we have met with civil society organizations whose mandate is to look at budget numbers and fiscal numbers and say, okay, tell us how you do it, tell us, do you have enough information, do you understand the information, is it published? Because it's not only about publishing, it's also how you publish it and when you publish it. We ask them, is this useful? And we have had very good conversations. We did a fiscal transparency evaluation in an advanced country that has very good results. And the pillar on public participation was one of the lowest. And the discussion was interesting, the discussion with the government, because the discussion went along the lines like, yes, all of our information is there, and it's there. But then we said, yes, but this is kind of difficult to understand. And they say, yes, but it's there. And this is a very, very transparent government. So there's still this link that has to be built of information for what, and the user being able to read it. So in part of our discussion with the government was, well, it will be useful if some of these tons of information that's out there, you just consolidate it better so that civil society can have a look at it from their perspective. So that is just one example of how we hands-on move on this agenda.
So you encourage them to present it in a useful way. Do you go further? Can you go further and encourage forums that they get involved in? Processes that bring other people into the discussion? So
basically, again, going back to the fiscal transparency evaluation, when we look at the issues of budget preparation, then we see whether you have a budget calendar, whether this is linked to your medium-term fiscal framework, whether at what point the parliamentary starts to. But in that, you have a clear open space for public participation, and we do ask. We do, let's say, record it. We are very methodological, so we go stage by stage. We do address the issue of whether civil society or public participation is present in the budget preparation and then in the budget implementation. Do they have a capacity to follow the implementation either of the capital budget and as how projects are being implemented, or even of your regular budget of the different line items. So yes, we do ask for that. we do record it. We are, and going back to your original question, are you able to your request of direct support? I don't see that as clear part of our mandate.
No, I meant support, not monetarily, because obviously that,
exactly.
the IMF doesn't do that.
I think the fund, and for example, when you have the annual and the spring meetings, the fund, the World Bank, there's always civil society forums. So part of the topics that get discussed in those forums, that's a way in which these international organizations can support, and they are always invited. There's a one day of civil society. So I was civil society, and gender budgeting was one of the ones that happened in the last fall meeting. So those are ways, and I do think Madame Lagarde has pushed very strongly for encouraging civil society, and so it's as at that broader level, but I think that's a good step in the right direction.
Aldo, maybe I can bring you in here and ask, whether you have ideas about this, how to improve civil society's participation in these budgeting processes.
It is a tricky area. I think it's very difficult to argue that it is not a good principle that there should be direct active participation in the budget cycle at all levels of government. It's very difficult to argue against it. But it is also a very tricky issue for ministries of finance. They already have very complex budget processes to manage. They already have to engage with lots of institutions across governments that demand and request and require funding and make the trade-off decisions. And then in addition, they have to take another set of information into account. So it is, I understand ministries of finance who say that it is a difficult area for them to work in, and that they have their formal systems that they need to engage with. So the question is, how do you overcome that reluctance that you often see from ministries of finance to engage either with organizations or with citizens? And I think this is an area in which we will learn a lot. There's experimentation going on across the world about how to do this. To my mind, one of the important streams of experimentation is what happens at the line ministry level. Because often civil society organizations, you get a few organizations and countries that look across all sectors, but many of them are sector or issue-oriented organizations that engage with budgets. For them, a better contact point would be the line ministry. So if you're an organization with interests in the education sector, your voice should be heard at the line ministry level. And there has been some experimentation in the Philippines, for example, where in the formal budget process, there are partnerships and validated partnerships at line ministry level. So that's an important avenue for governments to explore. A second point that I think is important to make on this is the kind of information that is available. In an ideal world, as you mentioned, citizens would be eagerly awaiting the budget documentation, and the moment it lands online, they will access it and they will start with their analysis. Now, that doesn't happen. Citizens either don't understand the documentation, but also they're not necessarily that interested. It often requires a very specific issue to get citizens fired up. So that happens at community level. Around investment in schools, is my clinic working, is my hospital working? But it also happens at a broad national level about big issues that emerge. And in South Africa, in the last 3 years, higher education financing has had everybody thinking about the allocations in the budget process. And suddenly we discover that actually from the budget documents, although South Africa is joint first, again, from the budget documents, the information in there doesn't tell you enough. So the point that I'm trying to make is We have to be able, when an issue arises, as a Ministry of Finance, to start thinking about what is the information that you're putting out there to illuminate this issue. Is there information beyond the... It's too expensive to publish all of that information up front. But do you have the capability that once an issue arises, as a Ministry of Finance interested in accountability, and of course this incentive compatibility between you and in your interest on having effective and efficient expenditure, what means do you have to make those further sets of information available? Do you have the means to provide the plans then to provide the structure of financing a sector, etc., to citizens? And I think two more points that I want to make here. The one is an issue that gets citizens fired up is corruption. It would be difficult to detect corruption just from looking at the information that's routinely required for the Open Budget Index. You need information about contracts, you need information about the procurement process, etc. And I think there is a barrier to that kind of information that exists for aid transparency, and it exists for government transparency, fiscal and budget transparency, and that is the notion of commercial confidentiality. It's a barrier that if you advocate for information to be available, that you run into the whole time. And clearly that is a valid issue, but I think where the boundary is for what can be available during procurement processes for citizens and for organizations to engage with, we're not clear on that. Maybe there needs to be work on that information. And then also what can be available after a procurement process when it is completed. That would be important to have more information around. And then just to take up the point about off-balance sheet information, that's where large corruption happens in aid flows, in financing of public companies and public enterprises. And that often doesn't fall, well, that's precisely because why it happens there, it doesn't fall within the, so if you want to get citizens involved, these are the issues that will drive them to get involved, and then you have to start thinking about what the information is that you need available for that.
I'm just slightly surprised none of you mentioned elections, because it's true that, you know, in the budget processes, it's kind of difficult to get, you know, citizens excited. But in my experience, when they get involved and, you know, have views about what's being spent, and there's a discussion about should we be spending this way or that way, is during elections. And some of the most impressive civil society work that I've seen done, you know, which has led to greater accountability and, I'd argue, strengthening of democracy, is providing information during election time about what is, you know, what did this government spend on, what did this MP spend on. So there's some important work by a civil society group in India, SNS, which has, you know, proved very effective in reporting this is what your MP spent their money on, and people respond in the vote. And I think that's, you know, we bureaucrats may think in budget cycles, but, you know, politicians think in electoral cycles. And I think, you know, that seems to be a pretty key lever to getting some of that transparency out during that time when people are paying attention and the media is paying attention. Anyway, so that's my little rant about how to link it into democracy.
Can I jump in on your little rant with my little rant?
Yes.
I'll double your rant, which is, so that's exactly why some of the measures being taken across the world to limit civil society voice matters, because in many countries, including this one, there have been discussions of disallowing civil society organizations from participating in that electoral process For example, the Lobbying Act, or there was a proposal by the Cabinet Office here in the UK about a year ago that suggested that any UK NGO that received money from government couldn't use that money to influence the political process. We also saw during the Brexit referendum a sort of self-censorship by lots of charities because they felt that they shouldn't be involved in the political process. And that phenomenon is being replicated all around the world, either regulation or self-censorship, because of this idea that independent charities are there to deliver good things, but not take part in what is a political process. But I agree with you, it's essential that they are there, and it's the best opportunity that we have.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I'm not talking about kind of, taking sides in a general election. That can obviously be the quickest way to, reduce your independence, but, making data available at a time when people are paying attention is, a good way to, the examples I was talking about is just publishing, this is what your MP spent their money on, during the election cycle. So, not taking a stance either way as to whether it's good or bad, but this is the information. So, Julia, I just wanted to come back to you and, obviously this democracy is somewhat different from kind of the things that you're thinking about, but are there particular avenues through which the private sector, can promote fiscal transparency? I mean, what are some of the best practices you've seen or things you're advocating for? I mean, you said you're asking questions when you go and see. Are there any other forums? Are you getting together as groups of investors and saying these are the things we care about? Or
yeah, we've been speaking a lot with our fellow panelists here about. On one hand, capacity, and on the other, incentives. We can certainly play the role of giving incentives, right? And as much as we engage on a sort of one-on-one level at roadshows or at meetings, we can also have a stronger voice by getting together as a sort of lobby group, if you like, to ask more of these questions. And that's some of the work we do with some of our colleagues out there in other asset managers. We formed this group that is called the Emerging Market Investors Alliance. Our funders actually in the audience, Ashok, to exactly engage issuers on issues of fiscal transparency, but also, for example, we have a group that looks at procurement, at transparency in extractive industries as well. So there are different groups that try and at least increase awareness and make the other side very much conscious of the fact that we do care about these issues, because we ourselves will have to respond on them to our own end clients that will want to know how we deploy their money and how we generate value from them from these investments. I would say that we again can provide one side, which is the incentives. Capacity is, however, key, and in this sense, I wanted to sort of give a shout out to the IMF, but also DFID, and the work that lots of other donors do, and that is very important. I was very fortunate to start my career working as a civil servant in the Nigerian Debt Management Office, which, as you know, benefited for over a decade of DFID assistance that allowed the office to build capacity in terms of officers that know their stuff, that can operate more advanced systems, data systems that allow them to generate more precise reports that are available on their website, reports that they can send to us as investors, to the extent that now the Nigerian local debt market is probably the most liquid one in Africa, if you exclude South Africa, which is at a very different stage of development. So these are things that pay off. They pay off over the long term, but from which we benefit directly as investors, and our clients do, and pension savers in the UK now do if they invest through us and we go to Nigeria, for example.
So I wanted to open it up to the floor now for some questions. There should be some roving mics somewhere. Yeah, at the back.
My name is Stephen Del So. I'm the director for ABC Educational International. I've been in education for 40 years. I was one of the creators of access to higher education in this country, starting in 1977. And the reason was to increase the number of working class people with no qualifications to enter higher education. To date, we have had 600,000 people going through over 40 years. I see all this I've been living in America for the past 15 years, and I've been a member of President Obama's kitchen cabinet, informal group advising on education. I say all this to say that there is an elephant in the room. And the elephant is this, that South Africa is joined first, and there are no representatives of South Africa on the panel. And therefore, we're left without a role model for Africa. We have had discussions all negative about Africa. Here we've got a shining example of a democracy, young democracy, 24 years old, moving from apartheid to now, and it's not represented here. This is a glaring omission. Why is this so?
Yeah, that's going to be a little slightly hard for the panelists to answer, but I think we've taken your point. Other questions? We do have a South African on the panel, but yeah. Okay, can we?
Thank you very much. My name is Olusegun Onigbinde. I am from Nigeria, and I'm happy with that comment. So if South Africa is doing well, Nigeria has been doing very, very bad. And I think we dropped from 24 points to 17 on the by number of points. And the question comes, and I don't think we're that bad. You know, I'm a lot involved in the process. But I think the problem is the survey comes within our electoral cycle. It comes in the time when our electoral cycle is just started. So there's a whole lot of distraction, and there's a whole lot of politicians have not settled down. We had like 4 budget directors in the last 2 years. So there was a whole lot of fluidity, and things weren't just, attentions weren't paid to a lot of things. And that doesn't say an excuse that it's not that we have been that great at South Africa, but we have been much more better. My question is, which also comes back on your rant, apologies, is that how do you protect this kind of the system, and make it so institutional? And how do we create a system where, even despite we have electoral cycles and distractions, the issues like budget transparency and fiscal transparency is more mainstream? And I guess people like IMF and Co can help us. Yeah.
Okay, one over here in the front.
My name is Samuel Markosian, PFM consultant. I'm interested to know what's the view of the panel in terms of the participation, citizen participation, engagement in consideration of digital platforms and changing technologies, how this can create a momentum of to create better engagement and more engagement of civil society.
And then did we have one over here? Yes.
Hi there, I'm Alison Holder with a partnership called Equal Measures 2030, and I wanted to hear a bit about, on the citizen engagement front, any thoughts the panelists had about particular groups of citizens that are often most left out of these kinds of conversations. So our partnership is about ensuring that especially girls and women's advocates are able to use data to advocate and to hold governments to account. And I think that certainly extends to budget data, particularly when we know that girls and women are also those that most benefit from the public services that government budgets are spent on. So just any particular comments on gender and exclusion from this, not just citizens in general.
Great, so maybe we can turn to the panel. I don't know who wants, we have election cycles, citizens, engagement, and marginalized voices. And South Africa. But it's a little unfair to us. These groups didn't select the panel. But
I guess I can come. So I think your point about Nigeria and the election cycle and the changes in the Ministry of Finance is important for the work we do as IMF with the member countries, because ours is a long-term engagement. And part of, I think, what has been discussed this morning was public financial management reform agendas take very long. And these surveys are done every 2 years. So I think it's important to see the long-term trend. going back to what I said a little while, and then drill down in the specific country and try to understand what exactly happened in the indicator. It might be that the indicators change, so that's one story. It might be that really there was a problem, and then that's a different story. So I think, and that is a challenge we have all across the world, and especially in Africa, because the countries are building capacity, but they have to do 10 things at a time. So it's understanding how this PFM agenda goes along and not follows or not leads to the transparency agenda, because I do think that both can go together. But on the other hand, I was budget director for years in Colombia, the first year when there was absolutely no money. So our priority was the fiscal numbers and try to put the budget under a constraint that was evident, but that the expending was not seen. So in that very difficult reform moment, you have to find ways of how to improve the transparency. So means complementing and doing, I think the message is be active, but be patient. Because if you are not patient, then also the little things that you have improved, kind of nobody looks at it, and I think that doesn't help. Digitalization, that is an area that the IMF, the Fiscal Affairs Department, is looking and working a lot. And this is also together with open data, because we cannot see this independent of the whole movement of open data. And I think there's the challenge of too much information, and then how do I really extract from it what is relevant? Digitalization it's an agenda that we promote as IMF. We are in the tax side and in the expenditure side. For example, we were looking at information that comes from IFMIS, the information systems, on daily payments. What do those daily payments tell you about the procurement? What do those daily payments tell you about the whole budget change? So we need to become, we countries, we institutions, we donors, we need to become more ambitious on how to use that information. But on the other hand, we also have to remember that we are still building in many countries the foundations. So it's this challenge between the broad agenda of information. And then girls, women. So the fiscal transparency manual, one of the principles, the public participation, in the fiscal transparency evaluation, we assess categories, and then you have basic, good, and advanced. Public participation advanced category includes that your budget tells a story for specific groups. Are you relevant? Are you able to see what is happening to women? Are you able to see what is happening to displaced people? Are you able to see what is happening to vulnerable groups? Is your budget information, does it allow to focus on specific groups? That's what is seen as advanced practice. So it's not just producing the information, but producing it for relevant policy making and relevant analysis from society of specific groups. And for that, obviously, one good tool is countries that have good performance budgeting processes, so that they are able to link better programs and projects to the policies they want to achieve and the results. That's going back to the technicalities of what we do. That will be one of the ways you can move forward that agenda.
Just on the digital platforms question, I think there are huge opportunities here, some of which are being realized, because there is an opportunity to have large-scale, relatively cheap, almost instant, real-time, meaningful conversations with a whole range of people on a whole range of issues. But there are also many, many risks that we're seeing. I mean, in many parts of the world, digital spaces are becoming increasingly surveilled by authorities. They're being used to entrap activists who are then not using these spaces because they don't feel safe safe or secure. We've got some very nasty behavior by the IT oligopolies around colonizing some of these spaces. And of course, there is a real digital divide still about who can access some of these platforms. But, this horse has bolted. We can't put the participation or the digital participation genie back in the bottle, so we've got to come up with more effective ways in which we can have meaningful, constructive, safe conversations about issues that matter in the public domain. And it's all to play for, I think, in terms of those of us who want to see more of this, coming up with some of those solutions, experimenting where we can. And I can't see Alison, because there's a poll, but I'm going to just talk to the poll. We, on a very different area around sort of SDG monitoring, we have an initiative called Data Shift, which is about shifting the power of data to the citizen. And we actually looked around all the SDG areas and looked at SDG 5 on gender equality, because that seems to be where we have some of the weakest data sources in terms of official data on aspects of gender equality, but also where we have some amazing, inspiring examples of women's rights organizations, using, curating, sometimes even generating citizen-generated data for accountability purposes. And there's a repository on our website, thedatashift.org, where you can see some examples, 20 or 30 examples on gender equality, where civil society organizations or networks or activists are starting to use data in more effective ways to drive accountability. Often at the local and national level, there's hardly any interoperability across countries yet, but that's where we go. So I think perhaps there are some lessons here too in terms of investing in that capacity that's there, investing in those bright sparks, and then building up into global best practices so that can be shared on gender equality or perhaps in many other areas.
I'm just going to come in. I'm not a panelist, but I'm just going to come in on the digital point, which is to say that, when I raised the point about media earlier, some of the researchers highlighted the role of radio as a medium that is accessible to the poor, and the critical role that plays in getting out the information. So when there were transparency reports in Brazil on local government, they were only effective in improving accountability where there was a local radio station. So it's that combination of the two, and that, we need to remember that, it's great for us to go online, but most people are getting most of their information, particularly in the poorer parts of the world, through radio. And I think we talked about capacity. I think there's a huge question of building the capacity of some of these, local radio stations type media, who, to be able to analyze all this data that is coming out, because they really play a critical role. As I say, that it was only when you had both the information and local media sources that you actually had the improvement in accountability. Did either of you want to come in on this, or shall we get some more questions? South Africa?
Well, I wanted to make a very brief additional point or complementary point to the discussion on how do you institutionalize transparency on a PFM reform platform, given cycles of government. And I think in the countries where one has seen a consistent improvement that has stayed in transparency, there has been a specific investment in units or in the systems to, on the basis of PFM reforms, then to get that information out into the public domain in a regular way. And I think that investment is key in surviving across governments within a state, the improvements that you have made on transparency. And just a quick point on who is left out. An obvious point to make is that it's usually the disempowered. So there's over decades in the field of participation, generally not only budget participation, looking at how the formal spaces that governments provide for participation gets captured by existing elites nationally, but also at community levels by those who are in power already, so that it doesn't create a significant change. And I think the link up between what are the digital opportunities and how do you give voice for the disempowered and the spread of cell phone technology is perhaps a key juncture to bring these together.
Julia, did you want to come in?
I'm just understanding the frustration that comes with political cycles. We do watch them very closely, obviously, in our work. We just have to accept the fact that, as we said time and again, even on this panel today and on the report that presented, progress is unfortunately not a linear path. There will be hiccups. Again, I was just on another country this week where the previous government had rolled out the IFMIS system to improve their procurement process and their spending, had finished its mandate with a couple $2 billion worth of arrears that came out of nowhere. And the new government was telling a set of investors that came from the US and the UK to hear them out and said, well, we're going to improve our procurement process by rolling out IFMIS, the IFMIS. So a few of my colleagues were rolling their eyes at that suggestion. So, it comes and goes. Political will is incredibly important. It's necessary to put out those systems, to put them in place, but then you obviously need the will to use them appropriately.
So I have one question from our digital platform. How can the reluctance of ministries of finance to improve public participation be overcome? And then we have one from the audience.
Thank you. Titus Alexander, Democracy Matters. It's great to see such a wide range of stakeholders on the panels today. And I've got a particular question around the financial sector, because often finance is a very powerful player and can distort politics, can buy politicians, and can create incentives that are not positive and counteract what civil society is doing. So my question, what is and what more could finance do to strengthen transparency, combat corruption, and particularly around questions of procurement and proper payment of tax?
Okay, maybe we'll we have a bit more time. Another question, yep.
Thank you. I'm Ikram Afzali from Integrity Watch Afghanistan. My question is related to budget transparency and encouraging not only politicians but the bureaucracy. I think some of the panelists, Danny, I think you talked about the mismatch between the goals of budget transparency and the priorities on the agendas of the politicians. But I think part of the problem, and the huge part of the problem from my experience in Afghanistan, is the bureaucracy, who don't really believe in sharing information, probably because of the nature of bureaucracy, lazy and trying to hide their inefficiency. But how do you harness this culture of sharing information, particularly budget information, and the bureaucracy?
Thank you. Once again, I'm Julius Mukunda from the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group in Uganda. I just have just two comments, and one is to the IMF. I think it's important to note that IMF is a very powerful institution, and it does so much work behind doors in directing governments on what they can do. And I think for me is that promoting open budgets could be one of them through your article for consultations and the numerous missions you make in respective countries. We are somehow trying to, in Uganda, it is currently taking shape because at least we have been able to engage IMF, and then on that side, they can be able to engage government. If we can tune it a bit more, IMF can be at the forefront of promoting open budgets and transparency. The second and last is around, I've seen citizens' participation, I think, is one of the weakest in terms of the ranking, especially from sub-Saharan countries. Two things. One is structured dialogue with governments. Currently, participation is, they do it at their own will or it's by accident. And I think number 2 is consistency. This year you've done so well with Ministry of Finance, but next year you are off the mailing list. You don't attend a single meeting. So we need to look at how we can be able to sustain these engagements and consultations. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay, so we have ministers of finance. All the actors here have been raised. Ministries of finance, the financial sector, bureaucrats. How do we get them more comfortable with being transparent? And the IMF. And I think that it's interesting if I think back to the time when I was working at the IMF many years ago. The IMF has come a long way in terms of improving transparency over the years, which is, good to see. When I was first there, that everything was incredibly secret, and everyone thought the whole thing would fall apart if we, let anyone into the discussions. And proud to be part of the UK delegation pushing for more transparency there. So let's start with you, financial sector, causing lots of problems potentially.
Starting on a positive note.
Yes. Well, we've heard the good things that the financial sector can do in, providing incentives, but, maybe they're not always on the right side.
No, sure. I mean, it is undeniably the case that there are issues, but at the same time, it boils down to, again, asking the right questions individually as an asset manager, collectively as a stakeholder group. As I said before, there's a growing number of us that are getting together to do this. It is early stages, but I think it can be a powerful force. As much as you assign to the sector the potentially disruptive power to create problems, you then should see it as a positive force if it is channeled in the right direction. And to that extent, we are getting increasingly pressured ourselves from governments, government regulation that asks more and more what we're doing with people's savings or individuals that come and ask us to produce more returns for their assets, but also, again, from the end client itself that comes back to us and asks us, what is your ESG policy? What do you do on environmental issues? What do you do on governance issues? Would you invest in a country that has certain standards of governance? So they are not only asking those questions, but increasingly demanding products that are really tailored towards that. So that's another interesting development that we've seen only more recently, but it is gathering pace. So I think it's about, it's a chain of reaction. And as much as we're pressured to do more in the positive direction, more can be done. Ultimately, again, in any roadshow, in any meeting, in any engagement with, say, a government that issues a bond, we can be asking the right questions and potentially drill deeper and deeper. At the same time, other than trying to look at even specific indicators such as, for example, how much of your revenues are coming out of taxes, what are you doing to improve that portion that comes out of taxes, or how much are you paying in interest, or what's the size of your public wage bill, because you're spending a good chunk of your money on that. Are you building for the future instead? So we can ask those questions. At the same time, on the other side, there needs to be the willingness not only to share, but also to some extent, if there's a government that decides instead of buying, vessels for building out its capacity in the marine environment, decides to buy weapons instead, there's only so much we can do. We are not police. We can only ask questions and, as much as possible, rely on our judgment and our experience in making those investments, and obviously try and steer clear from any such developments, but that boils down to criminal action that I believe none of us wants to get involved in, obviously.
Okay. Who wants to take the next go? You want to take the IMF question?
Yeah, the IMF. I mean, I agree. Obviously, we are a powerful institution to move this agenda, and I think we are really invested in it, and we are really doing it not only, so we have basically the programs, which is Article 4 and all that part, the surveillance area, and our technical assistance, and in our case, public financial management agenda. So I think we and I do agree with you. I mean, the first, it's like lead by example. So the fund has become much more transparent. All the information, it's out there. In my case, when we do technical assistance on public financial management, we always tell at the end to the government that we will publish unless they say no. So it's kind of, and then many times they say no. And you have to also understand because, and it's a challenge because we really go very deep into details because we want to understand the problem and try to fix it. So some of the reports are very technical, very, very technical, which will not really, let's say, contribute a lot in terms of creating an understanding. I'm assuming a group of citizens receives this report and say, okay, what are you saying here, basically? But for example, the fiscal transparency evaluation, which by the name we kind of say needs to be published. All of them have been published. Some countries have published immediately. Others have taken a while. I think 1 or 2 have not published. But we do push for the publication, and that is an agenda that it's going to go forward also important. And I think the work we are doing on fiscal risks is very relevant because it might not be the focus, for example, of whether you are investing in health or education, but this is, you really need to put all that information, first collect, because basically it's first understand where are your contingent liabilities and then produce the information for designing a mitigation strategy. It's for a purpose. You don't want to have the list of all your potential problems and just cross your arms. You want to have your list and then address those. So I think those are specific areas in which we are pushing from the technical assistance side, the transparency agenda. And I forgot to mention, and I will, gender budgeting, we are invested in gender budgeting. That is something I would say new for the fund. It's been pushed by Madame Lagarde, so high level. But in terms of the public financial management, I call gender budgeting good budgeting with a gender focus. And to have a gender focus, you need information because, I mean, you cannot just talk about nice headlines and then don't do anything. So again, taking just one of the questions that were asked before, a specific topic, we are pushing that. So does your budget document talk about gender budgeting? Do you have information that it allows to make gender discrimination in terms of seeing either in the inputs or the outputs? Do you, as oversight institutions, are looking to those topics? So yes, we are pushing it. It takes 2 to tango. So you also need the government to want to do it, and for them to want, they need to understand what are the benefits. I think, as we have said, it's capacity and it's incentives. And having been budget director and spent hours producing information that then nobody looked at was also depressing, because you are like, you get this, like, there's no transparency, and I'm like, okay, we spent 3 months and there's all this information and nobody paid attention. So we ended up giving courses to journalists so that they could understand our information, more or less.
Great. So you did answer a little bit the bureaucrat question. I don't know if the others come in.
I've never been a bureaucrat, and I don't know much about fiscal transparency, but here are 5 ways that 5 arguments I would use with the sort of reluctant bureaucrat, if you will, in no particular order. I think one has to be around competition. We've already heard whether it's investors looking, forum shopping or rankings like this one, sort of saying, you've got to do this because we need to be up the top of the rankings and therefore we need to be more competitive for whatever reason. 2, we've heard lots about political leadership, that if we've got the political leaders, the political masters of the bureaucrats convinced that this is a good thing, despite the sort of yes minister reluctance of the bureaucrats, we might have a better chance of driving this agenda. 3rd, I think to the point around structured dialogues or structured opportunities to have these. Structured, and I would add maybe perhaps relatively safe opportunities for constructive dialogue on some of these sorts of issues. And that's there, it's in the cycle, it's in a regular event, it's something that can't be gotten out of. so that the reluctant bureaucrat can't really to move out. I think there's something around accountability and finding new ways of holding officials to account for delivery. And this is a wider issue than just fiscal transparency, and I would argue it's wider than just in the global south, that we're struggling to find ways of, we've opened up a whole range of how government works, but now as citizens we know a bit about that. How we then hold power to account becomes difficult. I mean, we see this most clearly when it comes to international governance or global governance. You know, the sorts of decisions that are taken on our behalf by unaccountable, unelected officials, often behind closed doors, sort of beggars belief in terms of anything to do with democratic decision making. And I think we need new ways, again, respecting that these are professionals who need to have the space to do their job, but still, you know, with some degree of accountability. I often joke in SDG meetings that I have never ever heard of a single official losing their job because of a failure to meet an MDG target in the donor world or in the recipient world. And what we have to have in the SDG era is some mechanism of holding to account, perhaps not necessarily leading to people losing their job, but exposing where failure or success is happening on the delivery of sustainable development. And the fifth one is perhaps the best one of all, which is that surely there's enough evidence here that doing this in a meaningful way improves outcomes. There's some evidence that tax receipts might go up if you'd have more meaningful participation in your budgeting process. There's, of course, lots of evidence that suggests that you have a better grasp of what impact you're making, how effective public services really are. And so, you know, perhaps to the enlightened and well-meaning bureaucrat, that might be the strongest argument. So there's 5 to start.
Great. Alton, maybe you can wrap us up as we're running out of time.
I have 2 to add to those, to the 5. And one of them is that one has to take into account that bureaucrats work within a rule-driven environment. They don't always feel secure to release information. One of my favorite stories is, yes, South Africa is right on top in this proactive transparency, because that is written into the legal framework for public financial management, etc. However, there has also been a study a few years back of access to information and how different countries perform, and in that South Africa ended right at the bottom of about 7 countries that they looked at. It took the longest, the worst quality information came out, it was just ignored. The point that I'm trying to make is you have to write the rules in a way that identifies what information you cannot release, rather than the rules written in a way that identifies the information that you must release. Because once you have rules written to say, as a bureaucrat, this is the information that you must release and can release, everything else would be off the table for a bureaucrat. So you have to go and look at the legal frameworks. And the second point is around culture. As in any public financial management reform, you can change it in a pro forma way. You can rewrite the rules, you can put the formal systems in place, but often that's just a layer that's being dressed over an informal practice that continues exactly like it always has. So in order to get real transparency and participation, following in the wake of that or coinciding with it active, you have to change the culture of organizations. And this means that ministries of finance, and unfortunately they are the hub of all of this, they would need to start thinking much more carefully about how do you change the culture of my organization? How do I change not my capacity, but my capability to deliver on transparency? Where are my champions? How do I change the way that the bureaucrats within the ministry views transparency? And then also at line ministry level, how do I change that at subnational level? Who are the champions? What is the change management process that I need in order to make transparency not only a thin layer that I dress up on top, but actually a fundamental change in how this government works. And that, we mentioned long-term already on the panel, that is a very long-term process that can take decades. and might not, even in South Africa, might not go altogether that deep.
Great. Well, I want to wrap up the formal session here and invite you to informal session where we can chat more and with the panelists. Is that next door where the refreshments were earlier? Yes, excellent. And I mean, I've learned a lot from this panel. I think it's, as somebody said, it's been really nice to have people from such a different variety of, sectors and experiences talking on this issue. I think we've learned, some of the challenges, talked about some of the incentives, and I was really pleased that we ended up with some practical steps to take this agenda forward. So thanks everyone for coming, and look forward to chatting more in the over refreshments next door. Thank you. That was great.